Indigenous Civilizations: A Story of Downfall and Defeat by Alias Sadek. Mexico and South America, home to two of the world's greatest indigenous civilizations. Within the hot, tropical climate of Lake Texcoco, within the Valley of Mexico, the fortress of Tenochtitlan was built by the Aztecs, then one of the greatest civilizations to rule Mesoamerica. Their leader, the great Moctezuma II, cultivated an empire rich in culture, agriculture, and warfare, stretching from Mexico to Honduras. Culturally advanced, the Aztecs sustained a two-calendar system and created a language based in glyphs, allowing them to document daily life, religious practices, and legends within codices. Further south within the valley of the Andes mountain range thrived the Inca, a population of over 16 million natives who flourished in a city of well-developed roads and tunnels, supported by a strong system of government under Atahualpa, soon to become the last great emperor. Within their great city of Saskatchewan, the civilization developed an official language and sustained quipos, detailed government records for the entire empire. Both of these great civilizations were a measure of time and information, yet within a generation were crushed by the growing storm of colonization. What foreign power could accomplish this? Who could succeed to invade and conquer transoceanic empires of millions of indigenous people? History states it's within the feet of conquistadors, such as the infamous Hernando Cortes and Francisco Pizarro. But upon arrival to the American shores, it was not their guns or horses that would determine their success. The hidden weapon to devastate thousands of natives was an invisible organism, a microparasite far more powerful than anything the Spaniards knew they possessed, but more importantly, one they were already immune to. The Americas would soon become the first host to the growing epidemic of germ warfare. The arrival of Cortes and his army of 600, armed with horses and gunpowder, managed to conquer the Aztecs within 2 years of their arrival in 1519. Believing he was a god, the Spaniards were welcomed by Moctezuma into their civilization, unaware of their impending doom. A decade later, the same fate would be met by the Incas due to Pizarro's army, growing civil war, and more aggressively, the earlier arrival of the same silent killer that devastated the Aztecs. This invisible enemy was smallpox, a native European infection that can replicate and survive through close human contact. But how was this deadly disease so easily transmitted throughout the indigenous population? And why were the Spaniards left unharmed? The smallpox virus enters its hosts through the nose and throat, where it then travels to the lungs and replicates. Its incubation period was as short as 12 days, meaning its hosts can begin showing symptoms of large pustules within a matter of days. These infectious pustules usually coated an individual's hands, face, and eventually their entire body. The native civilizations proved to be a fresh breeding ground for the smallpox virus. The indigenous people lived and worked in close proximity to one another, allowing the transmission to occur easily and spread like wildfire within the population. Lack of immunity and a failure of traditional native techniques resulted in droves of natives dying. In addition, natives attempting to flee the city led to agricultural depletion, allowing for greater numbers to die from disease and starvation. Amongst the chaos of the growing epidemic, the Spaniards were ripe for conquest. Unlike the natives, their European descent and previous exposure to the viral infection acted in their favor. Centuries of living and consuming their products produced by domesticated animals led to the cross-transmission of deadly infections such as smallpox and measles, allowing the Europeans, who survived bouts of these epidemics, to gain immunity through antibodies. As populations evolved and grew exponentially, the amount of individuals with immunity increased, eventually decreasing the impact of these infectious diseases. In contrast, the Native Americans' sparse interaction with the llama and alpaca were not sufficient enough to induce the transfer of infections. This lack of exposure to mammalian disease left them vulnerable to the foreign strain of smallpox. In addition, ecological strain of the landscape began to influence the indigenous populations even prior to the arrival of Cortes and Pizarro. Cultivation of staple crops per acre was high, while population surmounted, thus leading to high levels of erosion in response to the great demands for food. This, coupled with lack of previous exposure to disease, contributed to their two factors in defeat by the Spanish. By the early 1600s, indigenous populations plummeted to approximately 1 million natives. Approximately 95% of the people were killed through war and disease. So where did this leave the previously thriving Aztec and Incan empires? Moctezuma and Atahualpa became the last rulers of their empires as they were killed and their lands divided due to influences of conquerors and civil war. Any surviving natives were subject to the influences of the conquerors, giving rise to the encomienda system of slavery, which soon became a popular method of social control. The landscape exhibited a cultural vacuum, as the eradication of the natives consequently resulted in almost the complete disintegration of their culture. Most Aztec codices were destroyed by the Spanish, and only a few hundred quipos survived Pizarro's conquest. Witnessing the Christian Spaniards' resilience to the epidemic, many natives lost faith in their indigenous religion, and Spanish missionaries began to transform traditional beliefs. Although practically extinct following Spanish conquest, these great civilizations live on in their legends. Their civilizations remain imprinted on the land, and staple foods produced through their agricultural methods, such as tomatoes, corn, and potatoes, were taken from the Americas and introduced to Europe. Though disease allowed the Europeans to conquer the Americas, it also began one of history's darkest eras. The death of the indigenous populations led to labor shortages, which began to limit the growth of the European populations in the Americas. Spanish conquistadors now looked towards another shore to supply a new source of labor and begin a practice that would last centuries. My discussion question for you is, what impact did the demise of the indigenous people have on the biological landscape of the Americas? Did evolution play a role in their inevitable susceptibility and defeat?